Welcome to Werezilla's Retrospective. I'm your host, Werezilla. And this holiday season, we're getting a real Christmas miracle. A live-action Transformers movie that's actually good. Sure, for what it's worth, the first, third, and fourth movies have their moments. The first one is a decent start despite the growing pains that a first entry in any series is stuck with. Dark of the Moon and Age of Extinction were flawed movies with some things I liked well enough to bump them up to watchable in my eyes. But Revenge of the Fallen and The Last Knight were massive low points that do a disservice to Transformers as a whole.
I am directly below the enemy scrotum.
So imagine how I felt in 2018 when a group of friends invited me to go see Bumblebee in theaters. My first thought was that the series was going down the same path the X-Men films had gone. A series that had a decent start with room to grow, but started losing its audience's patience with the second and especially third film's release.
I'm the Juggernaut, bitch!
Prompting Fox to try to save the film series by making a spin-off about its most popular character, resulting in X-Men Origins Wolverine, a redundant film because Wolverine was already the main character of the previous three movies, with his origin being thoroughly explored in the second, so it came across as desperation on the studio's part. Oh, and the less said about Deadpool's role in that movie, the better.
Hey, it's me! Don't scratch!
With all this in mind, it looked like Transformers was about to do the same thing. After 5 movies with a lot of focus on Bumblebee, putting so many other characters in the background in order to give him more screen time, a solo movie starring the character was only going to be a disaster. Or at least, so I thought. Turns out Bumblebee's movie has less in common with X-Men Origins Wolverine and more with X-Men First Class, if we were to continue to use that film series for comparison. One thing's for sure, Transformers has followed an X-Men's example by making Bumblebee the face of the brand the same way Wolverine is shown in almost all X-Men marketing, resulting in a lot of Bumblebee toys and merchandise. You got Bumblebee jackets, Bumblebee lunchboxes, Bumblebee go-karts, Bumblebee Pez dispensers, Bumblebee mugs, Bumblebee Easter egg holders, Bumblebee USB ports, Bumblebee keychains, Bumblebee costumes, Bumblebee phone cases, Bumblebee transformable plushies, Bumblebee the flamethrower!
Kids love this one.
Okay, I exaggerate with the Spaceballs thing, but one thing I didn't make up was Bumblebong. I doubt this is an officially licensed product by Hasbro, but I kinda want one. All this in mind, one has to ask, how exactly did Bumblebee become the most famous Transformers character? Seriously, he might be more famous than Soundwave at this point. One thing I'm sure contributed a lot back in the 80s was how easy it was for kids to get their hands on his toy. He was one of the Autobot mini vehicles, some of the smallest and cheapest toys in the range. If a kid asked for Bumblebee on Christmas or their birthday, they were going to get one. But the biggest factor had to be his role in the cartoon, both for being willing to brave impossible odds despite being small, as well as being best friends with Spike, the primary human character. He was consistently drawn as being only a head taller than human characters, making it easy for kids to imagine themselves in Spike's shoes. One other thing that I'm sure helped was his voice acting. The original series brought on a lot of seasoned and professional voice actors, and this included Bumblebee's actor Dan Gilvezan.
I'm not so sure, Sunstreaker. Some of my best friends are humans.
He makes Bumblebee sound young, but avoids the naivete and dopey speech pattern that some later Kid Appeal characters have had. Energon Ironhide being the first one that comes to mind as to how not to voice a Kid Appeal character. Speaking of the Unicron trilogy, you might remember that he was completely absent from all 3 entries of that series, as well as the Beast Era and 2001's Robots in Disguise, primarily because Hasbro lost the trademark on his name. But they got it back in time for the live-action movies, introducing him to new audiences, and as a result, he's been in every Transformers series ever since. To the point that Hotshot was initially going to be part of the main cast of Transformers Animated, but Bumblebee's newfound fame convinced Hasbro to put him in instead. Ironic considering not having the trademark on his name is why Hotshot was conceived of for the Unicron trilogy in the first place, instead of giving his role to Bumblebee back in 2002. Now, I have my issues with how much exposure Bumblebee has gotten. The 2010s were a time when Hasbro was really trying to push him into a role similar to Hot Rod or Hot Shot, that being the kid who succeeds Optimus Prime as leader and struggles with personal doubts about living up to his legacy. So when he becomes the title character in his own movie, I went to see it hesitantly. But sometimes it's a good thing when your expectations are not met. Let us begin. Part 6. Herbie the Love Bug.
Please. This is a mistake.
Stay cool. Hold your fire.
I don't want to hurt anyone.
Are you sure about that?
Did I just make the most obvious joke I possibly could? Maybe. I got a similar one that you'll be seeing in a few minutes at most. Anyway, the purpose of the first scene in a film is to hook the audience, and as far as the live-action Transformers films are concerned, this one has to be the most attention-grabbing opening yet. A battle on Cybertron as the Autobots are forced to retreat from a Decepticon attack. It reminds me of the trailer for War for Cybertron. After all, plenty of the characters in the trailer are also in this scene. Notably, everyone has been given a design closer to their G1 counterparts, making it easier to tell them apart. The design aesthetic of the first 5 movies tried to emphasize their alien and robotic nature, but that made so many of them ugly to look at. They were over-designed with too much detail, making it hard to tell what certain body parts are supposed to be. All the extra Autobots in the second and third movies looked like car parts that had been assembled like a jigsaw puzzle into a vaguely robot shape. The Decepticons in particular lacked unique color schemes, which is why one of the most common criticisms of these films is, the robots all look the same. The designs in this film are simpler but more distinct as a result. The film then shifts focus to Bumblebee as he's ordered by Optimus Prime to find a new planet for the Autobots to use as a base, which of course ends up being Earth circa 1987. A significant year considering the original cartoon ended in 1987. Then again, in universe, the cartoon's final 3 episodes took place in the then distant future of 2007, which in the real world was the year the live-action film series debuted.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme. Every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one. Hopefully it'll work.
Speaking of the 2007 Transformers film, a squad of agents from Sector 7 are in the middle of a training exercise when Bumblebee lands on top of them, leading to a chase between him and the agents. Normally, this would be the part of the video where I would tell you the squad leader is played by John Cena, but I doubt you would believe me if I told you, because you can't see him. I told you I had another obvious joke. Was it worth the wait? Bumblebee tries to negotiate after being cornered, but then a Decepticon attacks, wiping out most of the agents and ripping out Bumblebee's voice box. I guess I should acknowledge the first film's tie-in comics depicted Megatron as the one responsible for Bumblebee losing his ability to speak, which was carried over into Transformers Prime and Cyberverse. However, the first movie never specified how it happened exactly, and since the films typically ignored the comics anyway, I don't think this qualifies as a continuity error. But there is the big one, the time period this takes place in. Remember how the Last Knight established Bumblebee was present on Earth during World War II? If you do, then you might be asking how to reconcile this with his first arrival on Earth being in 1987, 4 decades later. The simple answer is you can't. It's a big reason why people started to debate whether or not this movie is intended to be a prequel at all, or if it's a reboot for the films. Paramount and Hasbro being very wishy-washy on the topic has not helped, vaguely saying it's a reboot some of the time, while other times saying the first 3 films are still canon, with the caveat being the directors of future movies have the creative freedom to pick and choose what they like as canon. If I'm interpreting their corporate speak correctly, this is more like a jumping on point for new audiences, ones who can start watching here without having to worry about needing to watch the other movies first. Convenient for marketing the movie, even if it means the audience isn't sure how they connect. Well, be this a reboot or a prequel, the real draw of this movie is the bond that forms between Bumblebee and the main human character of the film, Charlie, a moody teenager who is still processing the recent death of her father. Not helping things is that her mother has seemingly moved on with a new boyfriend. Unable to fix the car she and her father were trying to repair before his death, Charlie tries to vent by instead fixing up a broken-down Beetle. Surprising nobody who's read the first issue of the Marvel Comics, this old car turns out to be Bumblebee, damaged and terrified and suffering from amnesia after the earlier ambush. Bit of a cliché, but even a cliché plot point can be presented well. Much of the second act of the movie has the two form a friendship that helps them heal from their personal issues. It's genuine character interaction, and feels like these two are really friends by the end rather than simply two characters thrown together by circumstance. A lot of this movie's success was dependent on the mostly solo performance of Haley Steinfeld reacting to a special effect that's added in post. And she does a great job making Charlie one of the most memorable human companion characters to date. And yeah, if that name sounds familiar, it's because Steinfeld is most famous for playing Gwen Stacy in the Spider-Verse films. Interesting connection considering Bumblebee's G1 voice actor played Spider-Man in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, as well as Miguel O'Hara in Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. This whole year I've been caught in a tangled web weaved by the Transformers films and various different Spider-Men. What is happening? Charlie is the one who encourages Bumblebee to try to communicate using music, developing into his habit of piecing sentences together using his car radio in its best implementation since the first movie. In every movie after the first one, Bumblebee's lack of voice felt more like a gimmick that turned him into a random quote generator. In this film, Bumblebee is trying to remember who he is and why he's on Earth, and as such, he's more of a character. He's curious, caring, and even a bit of mischievous when given the right motive. Also, he ends up becoming a fan of The Breakfast Club, a film that starred Judd Nelson, the original voice of Hot Rod. Heh. And while Bumblebee does get rickrolled at one point, it also leads to some good bits, like when he offers some very welcoming encouragement.
A brave volunteer.
I didn't do that.
Wow. I was convinced that that song was never going to appear in a live-action Transformers movie. You better believe I stood out of my seat in shock when I was in the theater seeing this movie for the first time. I was definitely glad I went to see this movie after this. The rest of the characters fulfill their purpose well. Charlie's neighbor Memo is a self-admitted nerd with a crush on her, but it's by no means something the movie focuses on. Maybe I was so annoyed by the forced romances in the other movies that I'm seeing things that aren't there, but Memo's role feels like satire of those forced romances. Charlie's growing friendship with Bumblebee is more important to the plot. Excuse me, it is the plot. So while she and Memo become friends too in this movie, the crush thing is more like a gag that isn't given importance beyond that.
Oh, yeah, not quite there yet.
Nope. Yep. Okay.
Charlie's family, that being her mother, her mother's boyfriend, and her little brother, are an improvement over Sam's parents in that they change over time, going from being neglectful to being more trusting of Charlie, all without being obnoxious, which just goes to show this movie's priorities compared to the earlier films. When the human characters are trying to be funny, it's a lot more successful, especially with John Cena. When a pair of Decepticons arrive on Earth in search of Bumblebee and make contact with Sector 7, Cena has a witty reaction I can't help but laugh at.
They literally call themselves Decepticons. That doesn't set off any red flags?
It's come to my attention that the version of this movie that test audiences saw had some big differences, one of which was Cena's character being more serious, with reshoots adding more humor into his performance. And honestly, that may have been for the best since it plays to his strengths as an entertainer. If he had played the character straight, I probably still would have laughed, which would have been the opposite of what the filmmakers wanted. This way, I'm laughing with them, not at them.
No, don't run! Do not run! She ran.
What is it with the live-action Transformers movies and all the Johns? John Voight, John Turturro, John Benjamin Hickley, John Goodman, John DiMaggio, John Cena. Did I miss any? Oh wait, that's right. John Malkovich appeared in Dark of the Moon. I didn't mention him in my review of that movie because he barely did anything. I genuinely forgot he was in that film. Talk about a waste of talent. Okay, did I leave anybody out?
The humans are multiplying. Please, let me kill them. Not yet.
Right, don't worry. It was about time I transitioned into talking about the villains, the Decepticons Shatter and Dropkick. Compared to all the other Cybertronians we see in this movie, their design aesthetic is closer to the older Bayformers look, but that's where the similarities end. They have the basic dynamic of a brains and brawn duo, Shatter being the one who comes up with their evil plans and is the one holding Dropkick's leash. They are cunning enough to convince Sector 7 to give them access to Earth's phone lines and satellites, with the implication they invented the internet in doing so. If I wanted to be pedantic, I could say the internet did exist prior to 1987. It was simply not accessible to literally everyone like it is today. Whatever. They are also a physical threat to Bumblebee, requiring him to fight smart instead of trying to overpower them. Notice how these two are red and blue, so when they fight Bumblebee in the climax, you get all three primary colors on screen, meaning we can see everything despite the scene taking place at night. The previous movie's Decepticons' lack of color would have made it too hard to tell who was who, even in scenes that took place during the day, let alone at night with low lighting. Everything about them is a breath of fresh air compared to the earlier film's Decepticons. They are simple, but that's an improvement over no character at all. Which is a nice segue into the action in this movie. I've been saying since the start of this marathon that the action scenes would be improved if the camera was further from the characters so the audience could see what was happening on screen. And that's exactly what we get with Bumblebee. His fight with the Decepticon Seeker at the start, as well as his battles with Shatter and Dropkick, are all distinct from one another and have proper stakes. The chase scenes with Sector 7 are similarly engaging with a clear beginning, middle, and end to each scene. Also, there's a flashback to Cybertron showing Optimus Prime battling a squad of Seekers. And much like in the original series, he's able to take on the Seekers by himself, but then Soundwave sends out Ravage, who is able to put up a much better fight. It was Laserbeak who floored him in G1, but this scene has the same energy regardless. I praise the action scenes in this movie, which might be surprising considering the movie's stakes are lower. No large-scale city battle or pieces of Cybertron scraping against the surface of Earth or the threat of the sun exploding. The climax is simply Bumblebee and Charlie attempting to stop Shatter and Dropkick from calling for reinforcements. There's nowhere near as many explosions in this movie as previous ones either, showing you don't need catastrophic world-ending events to get the audience invested. If it involves characters they like, then something as simple as a fight around a radio tower or a chase in the woods does its job. As do the effects of this movie. While some shots are not as good as others, most of the time when a Transformer is on screen, it's a convincing effect. Remember what I said about the character designs because I think this contributes to why it looks the way it does. It's similar to how cartoons and comics will sometimes simplify the character models over time to make things easier for the animation and drawing the characters in general. Because with the Bumblebee designs being more Generation 1 inspired, and by extension more basic, the film doesn't have to cut as many corners. All of these things point to the filmmakers having wildly different priorities compared to the previous 5 movies. And there's a pretty understandable reason why, which we should probably address. I've already mentioned how the stakes aren't world-ending like earlier movies, and that's because this was a more character-driven film than its Bayformers predecessors. There's also the overall tone. Humor comes mostly from John Cena's wit or callbacks to 80s pop culture, as Charlie is shown to be a fan of a lot of different bands at the time. There's also Bumblebee's curiosity causing unintended property damage, like the scene where Bumblebee wrecks the inside of Charlie's house. It's where this film is at its most like E.T. Did I mention that Steven Spielberg is one of the executive producers of the Transformers films? And as for fan service, well, the primary source of the film's fan service is the G1 designs and references. In other words, not the sexual kind of fan service, which ironically makes it more mature. Of that variety, it's very brief and provided mostly by male characters. Also, it goes without saying the editing is so much less frenetic than the last movie. Bumblebee zigs in every way the last night zags. And that's a big reason why there were a number of changes made during production in order to distance this film from that one. The big discrepancy is ignoring Bumblebee fighting in World War II in order for him to arrive on Earth in the 80s instead. Then there's Sector 7, including a young Agent Simmons, plus they are using Hoover Dam as their base. Yet there's no sign of Megatron or the Allspark, which by now they should have access to if this is supposed to be a prequel. The absence of both has added to this debate, though considering Cena and his superior officer plan on betraying Shatter and Dropkick, the idea that they would hide their presence from the duo isn't implausible. In fact, we kind of know they are, because prior to the reshoots, there was going to be a mid-credits scene that showed Sector 7 did in fact have Megatron on ice, albeit with a more Generation 1 inspired redesign. A design that got its own toy, that's pretty neat. In its place is a new scene where Bumblebee meets up with Optimus Prime on Earth, along with Charlie finally fixing the car she and her father were working on. While this former scene would have set up the events of the other movies, I think I prefer the mid-credits scene we got, as it's more emotionally satisfying to end with the conclusion of Charlie's character arc. And that's how I feel about a lot of changes between the test audience version of this movie and the finalized version of the film. They don't set up the events of future or past movies all that well, but it improves the story and tone of this movie. So what does all of this mean at the end of the day? I clearly enjoyed this movie, but where do I stand on the whole prequel reboot question? It could go either way, really. On the one hand, I can see this being a reboot with the introduction of Bumblebee losing his voice, and Sector 7 in a new continuity being yet another example of Transformers taking old ideas and using them in later stories. I can also see this being considered a prequel in the broad strokes, with the only film it outright contradicting being The Last Knight. But as we established already, contradicting The Last Knight improves this movie's story. It's a lot like the Highlander series. I reviewed the second film a while back and it was pretty bad. So much that the third movie ignored its events and acted more like a sequel to the first movie. And now Transformers has followed suit, with Bumblebee and especially so with the most recent movie, The Rise of Beasts, which we will absolutely get to in February of 2024. Cause 2023 is about to end and I'm glad it did so on a high note. I look forward to seeing you all again next year. It will be a year full of dinosaurs, talking trains, insect aliens, cartoons about video games, aliens in prisons, giant monsters, Frankenstein, and of course the Transformers. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are as well.
Thank you
so much
for giving me my voice.
Eventually, you're gonna hang up the claws, and it's gonna make a lot of people very sad.
Huh?
But one day, your old pal Wade's gonna ask you to get back in the saddle again. When he does, say yes.
Oh, right.